Good morning. My name's Fred Rainbow. I work for the AFC and Naval Institute team. Those of you who have been with us the last 2.5 days know there's been a great deal of wonderful discussion and engagement, and that's going to continue with this panel. We've talked a lot about strategy, the human dimension, and this panel will focus on equipping the force for the new strategy, what's the right balance between reconstruction and acquisition. To lead this panel is Peter Schwartz. Hope some of you probably do know Peter, but Peter's been a unique force for good since he joined the United States Navy. He served in Vietnam. He served Admiral Zumwalt. He was special assistant to General Powell. He was one of the authors, really the true authors. Everybody claimed to be an author, but he was a real author of the maritime strategy. But if you were in there with us with the Google presentation, Peter's been connecting the dots for a long time. He gets the information, he gets the right people, and he doesn't look for any of the credit. So Peter, with that, make this work.
Thanks, Fred. I assume almost everyone here already knows Fred Rainbow. Those of you who may not, I should tell you that he's one of the nation's foremost patriots and defense experts. I've been proud to call him a friend and certainly a mentor for almost 30 years. It's great to be back in Tidewater, especially since it means getting outside the Washington Beltway for a few days. And I'm grateful to AFCEA and the Naval Institute for inviting me to moderate this panel. And this panel is the panel. This is the panel on acquisition, where the rubber meets the road. You did the right thing by coming here. Those of you who were here at the very beginning of the conference will remember that in his opening remarks, Ken Schneider said that the panelists, all the panelists, would all discuss what to hold and what to fold, when to hold them, when to fold them. That was very catchy. I listened to all the speakers and panelists, and with the clear exception of General Cartwright, who's made all the blogs and all the trade press in the last couple of days, I must confess I didn't hear an awful lot about what to hold and precious little about what to fold, with the exception of cuts in Army and Marine troop levels and disengaging from Afghanistan. Mostly what I heard was about all the new cards that had to be dealt because the game is changing. I also heard a lot about declining budgets. So reconciling all of that is going to be quite a tall order, and that is the subject of this panel and this event. AFCEA and the Naval Institute have assembled quite a panel for you. Vice Admiral Walter M. Skinner, U.S. Navy, has been the Principal Military Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition for almost 2 years now. He's also an experienced naval aviator, as well as a test pilot, one of the Navy's top professionals in financial management. He served as the PEO for Tactical Aircraft Programs and commanded the Naval Air Warfare Center. Vice Admiral Robert Parker, U.S. Coast Guard, is the commander of the Coast Guard's Atlantic area, the head Coast Guard operator for a geographic region that extends from the Rocky Mountains, remember the inland responsibilities of the Coast Guard, all the way to the Arabian Gulf. He's been the consummate U.S. Coast Guard operator and commander during his career, but he's also served as the Assistant Commandant for Capabilities in Washington, responsible for equipping, sustaining, and maintaining all U.S. Coast Guard forces. Major General Frederick Rudesheim, U.S. Army, is currently the Deputy J7 on the Joint Staff, where he's responsible for preserving and developing the Joint Forces' joint and coalition warfighting capabilities, especially in the areas of training, doctrine, concept development, and lessons learned, supported by modeling, simulation, and experimentation. An infantryman, a combat veteran, his operational and overseas experience includes 2 tours in Iraq and a stint in Korea. Finally, in a masterstroke, we have as a panelist one of the top civilian defense analysts in the nation, Dr. Eric Labs. Dr. Labs is the senior analyst for naval forces and weapons at the Congressional Budget Office in Washington. He specializes in issues relating to the procurement, budgeting, and sizing of the forces for the Department of the Navy. Yesterday, you heard General Dempsey take great pains to assure us that his CAG didn't spend its time grading the Joint Staff's papers. Well, I can assure you that Eric Labs and his colleagues spend a great deal of their time grading all of the Pentagon's papers, which is why he's such a valuable panelist for us. Each of our distinguished panelists will deliver some important opening remarks. When they've all concluded their remarks, I'm going to ask if they have any comments to make on any of the points that they've heard their colleagues address. And when that's done, I'm going to open up the floor for your questions. My own substantive remarks are pretty brief. It seems to me we should be dealing with three broad, simple, but vital questions here. What do we need to buy? Why do we need to buy it? And how will we be able to afford it? And what's the balance between maintaining readiness for current and near-term training and contingencies, and on the other hand, new acquisition for the long haul and for future contingencies? Ken Schneider asks, what do we hold? What do we fold? Most people have responded so far with, here's the new stuff I need. Let's see how our panelists do. Admiral Skinner.
Well, good morning, and thanks for having me here. So I'm going to get right into it and start talking about the three questions that Peter asked, because I think that's the crux of what the conversation should be this morning between the audience and the panelists. And my remarks will be fairly brief because that dialogue, that interaction is what we're seeking and I think what we want. So the first two questions I believe are interrelated. What do we buy? What do we need to buy, and why do we need to buy it? That has to be established by the requirements, communities in our various services, informed by the threat and by the national defense strategy that we're all operating under. And if we can establish the requirement with clarity and then have the will to stay the course with the requirement, that makes a difference. From an acquisition perspective, we're better at evolutionary acquisition than we are at revolutionary acquisition, but it's not just the Department of Defense. That's across all technologists. If you talk about what it takes to put a revolutionary technology into the field, it takes a lot more risk. We take a lot more risk in cost, schedule, and performance than we do if we're evolving an existing weapon system. Some observations over the course of the last couple of years in my particular job. When we start to buy a system, design and development is becoming more and more complex and harder and harder. When I was a program manager and more recently when I was a PEO, we used to focus typically on the technical. What are we going to get? And we used to define the technical with key performance parameters that said if we buy a weapon system, it has to go so fast, it has to do so many things, and if it doesn't do those things, then those are grounds for not buying that particular weapon systems. But all the other ancillary ilities that support that weapon system saw that particular methodology and said, hey, we want a piece of that. For example, as a program manager, when I got in some issues, emergent technical issues in my program, I had the flexibility to trade things like training and supplies, parts, things of that nature against that technology, and maybe free up resources within my program to pursue the emergent issues in the development. Today, that's not the case. Today, we have key performance parameters that define our training requirements, our support requirements. Our installation folks are getting involved in the design and development of our weapon systems because, if we design it to a certain size, it fits in the current infrastructure footprint that we have. If we design it larger or faster or bigger or better, then we might have to have bigger ports, bigger hangars, and that's a cost to the service. Life cycle cost is a big thing. Do we design it so that we can build it over the cost? And you've seen the data, I'm sure, that says that, 2/3 of the cost of a weapon system is beyond the time we buy it. Logistics. And then after we integrate all those things, we have to develop it in such a fashion that we deliver it on cost and on schedule. And our typical developments are 10 to 12 years, so 120 to 144 months, and we have to hit our milestones within 6 months of the schedule that we lay out initially. So we're within a 5 to 10% error band, and then the cost parameters that we have to deal with, defined by the WSARA Act, are about 15%. We get a balloon goes up, we have to notify, and at 25%, we're in a Nunn-McCurdy situation. So the parameters, the boxes that we live in from a cost and schedule basis are a much finer box that we have to live in today. So more complex design and development, tighter tolerances for the longer developments, and then since they do take a long time, the things that we predict that we need 10 or 12 years from now, things change. So how do we handle the emergent stuff? So all those things are, what do we have to buy? Why do we have to buy it? And how will we be able to afford it? The third piece is, I'm a proponent of buying them in the most efficient and effective way possible. So once we get through that design cycle, let's put them in a multi-year procurement. Let's lay out how many we want. Let's buy them and get the savings that we need and commit to long-term procurements for at least a portion of our portfolio, because that's the most efficient and effective way to buy. So if we can do that, I think we have a shot at coming up with the right mix of technologies and the right mix of capabilities at a price that we can afford, both in the development and the design and the procurement, but also in the support piece, so that we can equip a warfighter with what they need. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, VADM Parker.
Awesome. Thank you. And it's great to be here again. Always fun to come back to these. It's nice to be on the other side of the river for a change here, I guess. This is an interesting topic to us because whenever we come to a Joint Warfighters Conference, we try to be careful about towing that line. Technically, we're not warfighters, but we're always there in support. So there's really two sort of slices I want to talk to contextually here. One is the actual direct support we do to the warfighter, very narrow slice, one of the 11 mission sets that we have statutorily. And then the other things that we have that are the capabilities and authorities that we have that we can bring to a fight at any given time that we try to leverage as we go along the way. The discrete capabilities, I said, are very, very small. And that I don't see that fundamentally changing because it's still about physical protection and those kinds of things. And we're actually in a pretty good place in that one. So we're going to hold that one to answer that question. There's another piece to this, though, that's in the support part that's very nuanced, and that's this: how do you sustain the global lines of communication in order to support the warfighter? And we're in this business every day. We have people forward doing international port security business that work around the world. That's one place where I actually have global reach and do all the international port security liaisons for the Coast Guard that reach back to us. Very low number of folks with a lot of reach working on an international paradigm that you wouldn't think of normally as a best practice in order to gain security in the global supply chains, but it impacts our ability to support the warfighter, because if you can't move your stuff there, you're just not going to be able to affect operations at the other end. So we do this every day. That's another piece that we're going to hold, again, a very smarter way forward. When it comes to our full-time missions, though, I was reading my press clips this morning on the drive over here, and I'm a Coast Guard Academy graduate, and our Academy graduated yesterday, 233 really bright young folks with whom I would not have competed well, who are going to run out and do great business for the Coast Guard. And one of them is assigned to the Coast Guard Cutter Rush, which is the same ship that his grandfather commanded. That's extraordinary. 42 years young, this ship is. And these are the things that we know we need this capability in the fleet, and we know we're going to need to keep going at that. So how do we get after that, and what does that mean? The replacement for that is coming. It's coming slow. The numbers are tougher for us, I think, in the budget years, because those kind of capital assets are a much bigger slice of the part that we bring into the federal budget, and that's been a real struggle for us. And just like my colleague Mark said here, 10 to 12 years out, what are the technology pieces that are built into that? If it takes you that long to field something like that, how do you make that last over a life cycle of a ship that's going to span 3 generations? Those are very, very interesting challenges for us. So at the end of the day, every ship I have in inventory, except for the ones that are currently in construction, are doing missions that they were not designed for. Pretty extraordinary stuff. So agility has to be built into this. If you want to think of the things that we have built into this, you have to have ways to do this. Navy went through this with the LCS design. You've got modularity. There's struggles with that. There's warts and hairs that you got to work your way through. But at the end of the day, there's a certain quality and quantity when it comes to ships and aircraft, and you have to have these things when the contingencies come. And then the question is, how do you go about doing that smartly at the end of the day? A couple of new things that are coming to us that are giving us fits and starts as we try to recapitalize an old fleet, both in ships and aircraft. And we're better off in aircraft than we are in ships. It's based on risk, and frankly, ships drift better than aircrafts do, so we tend to spend more money up front on aircraft. But when you look at the new and emerging missions, it's really the same missions we've got, just in new places. The authorities are roughly the same with one exception, and that's cyber. And people, I'd be happy to chat up to that a little bit. DHS owns the cyber side on the all things not DoD gig, and that's a very, very interesting debate to have. But the one that is vexing us presently, both in the semi-near term and the longer term, that we've got to get at and figure out what we trade off in order to get there, that's the how do you afford it piece, is how do we operate in the Arctic? How do we maintain our sovereignty in the Arctic? It is fundamentally a maritime domain sovereign issue. So who does that? What parts of that are defense? What parts of that are security? Where does that line blur? If you don't get the security part right, do you have to go to defense? How much do you invest in each one of those portfolios? Those are all debates that are going on right now in the sphere of government. So I'd be happy to talk about that. And then finally, one of the things that I think we have to hold is our relationship with DoD writ large, and especially the U.S. Navy. We just can't do some of this stuff without that kind of muscle. Mark's R&D budget is double what our total operating budget is for the service. So our ability to leverage that and use that and do this in smart ways that are not redundant but are complementary are things that we're after in a very meaningful way. So we'd be happy to talk about that as well. So we'll look forward to taking your questions, and with that I'll pass it over to my other colleague here, Fred.
Hey, thanks, sir. Well, again, thank you all for having me. I'm the non-material guy in a discussion about material acquisition, current and future. But I think I have something to tell you today, and so bear with me. And then, of course, you'll be the judge of that. So I'm a local boy. We actually operate right here in the Suffolk compound. When Joint Forces Command was disestablished on 4 August of last year, it was deemed certain elements of the command needed to remain. They were critical, deemed such. And two of those aspects were development and training of the Joint Force. And so those coalesced in one organization called Joint Coalition Warfighting. And my position is Deputy Director J7, working directly for Lieutenant General Flynn, who's my direct boss, whose office is in the Pentagon. He comes down here very frequently. Actually, he comes down here more frequently than I make it up there, which is actually a pretty good deal. I get credit for being on the joint staff. I'm outside the Beltway. So all in all, a fantastic deal. But we've got about 1,500 folks now that are working directly for the joint staff. So the joint staff, my point in that is the joint staff is in unprecedented times. It isn't just a staff anymore in the strictest of sense, working for the chairman and the vice chairman and providing best military advice. But it's currently directly involved in training the joint force at the combatant command level and immediately below that at the component level. And then it has a development portfolio that is working across the entire joint force as well. And that's the joint staff of today. Totally unprecedented. Our mission statement is, on behalf of the chairman, we are supporting the training and development of joint interagency, and I must foot stomp, multinational. We've got 19 nations, 29 liaison officers that are part of our multinational coalition effort that reside with us. And that's the way we can inject them at the earliest possible moment in both training and development as part of our mission. And our purpose is critical here because we sit astride both the current and future requirements of the joint force. And so that's my next point, that what we're doing as an organization is I think we have the real promise of taking development and training and merging them in a way that heretofore we haven't done as well as we could. So you can get training and development injected into each other much earlier. It's not just because we're in the same organization, but it's the prime directive. What are you doing in development that will make it over to training, and how are you going to transition it? Just doing isn't sufficient. And then in training, what observations are you observing across the force, across the combatant commands that can be injected into our current concept development or experiments? So this is all in-house. So I think it's a very powerful notion. That, coupled with the fact that we have multinational partners that are already in our organization, I think gives us some real power. So when it comes to how it is that we look at things across doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, personnel, facilities, and policy, the M in that, the material piece, is very small. but we are supporting the training of any material that is being fielded. What's the one thing I can answer to Pete's question about holding and folding and then the right balance? I'm going to take a pass on holding and folding of the material piece, and I go directly to what's the right balance. And I don't know if this is right or not, but this is where we are today. We're spending, this is a scientific wild guess here, but we're spending about 70% of our effort on current training. And I'm going to caveat that for you. And then we're spending about 20% on future. And then we got about 10% on the stuff that just pops up, that's emerging. So I can't it's not really future stuff, it's just surprises that we have to take on. So that's about the breakdown. Now, the chairman said something yesterday that I want to reiterate. He talked about this, I think, a very powerful notion that when you talk about the force of 2020, when we talk about our concept of Joint Force 2020, that about 80% of that force is in being today, when we talk about the actual material aspect of the force. But the difference is, how do you use that 80%? If it's being used in the exact same fashion it's been used in the past, then we missed the bet. And our organization takes a look at training, even though I just laid out 70% in current. That means taking what we currently have and then looking for new and innovative ways to use what we have, even as I have a developmental aspect of our organization focused on future developments. It is all about people. It is about the human domain, and in the non-material aspect of things, that's where you really have some leverage. So we do understand this, and this is where General Flynn, talked about this in his remarks at the very kickoff of this conference. He talked about the fact that we came up with a joint operation environment concept I think it was published in 2010. We didn't republish it. Here it is, 2012, because a lot of what it predicted is coming to pass. With one caveat: it's happening faster than we predicted. Change is happening faster. He makes the point about the Cold War, taking about 47 years to evolve, and it took Arab Spring, 3 months, depending on when you start and stop the clock. So things are happening much faster than they have in the past. And so how is it that we can respond to that? And that means leaders have to be more agile and flexible-minded. And how do you train to that? So that's our task at hand. And my last point is simply this, and it feeds into how you train leaders. It goes to mission command. You've got to get away from the material aspect of things and understand what's the intent of your higher headquarters and operate even if you're in a degraded mode. That means you can't communicate or can't communicate as well as you would like. That the common operating picture, as we so cavalierly throw it around sometimes, will not be a clear picture, but rather fuzzy pixels. And you have to figure out what it is that you're supposed to do based on intent rather than having direct guidance. And that means you have to understand what's in the head of your superior and your superior's superior, and that's the essence of mission command. So I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Eric?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Peter for that kind introduction, and I need to state at the outset that the views I express here are my own and not those of the Congressional Budget Office or the U.S. Congress. And then I would also just begin with saying that while I am prohibited from making recommendations, I would like to offer up a few general observations and comments for this discussion that, in my opinion, flow logically from the recent events, from the administration's new strategic guidance, and the future fiscal environment. Now, with 3 to 5 minutes, I won't pretend that they are going to be particularly deep, but I hope they will offer some framework for some useful discussion. First, after our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think the current and future administrations are likely to follow what I would call the Princess Bride strategy of international relations: don't start a land war in Asia. Indeed, this was one of the major tenets of Secretary Gates' final thoughts, is that any future Secretary of Defense who recommends starting a land war in Asia should have his head examined, or Africa or the Middle East for that matter. I think that deliberately or indirectly is going to be a major constraint or a shaping factor on U.S. foreign policy in the future. Second, if you follow from the logic of the strategic guidance that we are rebalancing towards Asia, and you also follow the precedent that we're not going to engage in a major land war in Asia, then it follows logically, it seems to me, that U.S. military forces are going to be more air and sea centric, with less emphasis, indeed much less emphasis, on ground forces. Now, the words naval forces do not actually appear anywhere in the strategic guidance, but I think the implication in that guidance is quite clear. So, in that sense, as ground forces come home and the Asia-centric strategy becomes more prevalent, that means we're going to be reducing the Army and Marine Corps force structure. And at the same time, perhaps not be in quite as much of a rush to reconstitute and refit that force structure that remains. Third, with respect to U.S. military spending priorities, then, they would focus on air and sea platforms, and especially air and naval weapons and sensors. Many of the platforms that we have now are going to be around for a very long time. 10 years from now, most of the fleet that we have today is still going to be in the fleet. But improving the capabilities of those platforms is going to sort of take increasing importance. And it seems to me we would buy things that would be useful in a conflict with China, which, if the history of the rise and falls of great powers is any guide to it, the United States and China will be headed towards some sort of adversarial or rivalry relationship. So investing in those systems, along with U.S. grand strategic focus in the Pacific, would signal to other nations that the U.S. is here and it plans to stay. It is a deterrent to the adventurism of other military adventurism of other powers, and reassurance to allies and prospective allies that you are not alone in standing up against an aspiring regional hegemon. An example of this are the first baby steps that we've seen about basing LCSs in Singapore. I would be the first to concede that the LCS is not in any way going to be frightening China in any particular way. But it seems to me what China might be afraid of is what those LCSs symbolize and represent. They represent the U.S. commitment to a region. They are reassurance to allies. And hopefully what we get in return is less compliance from other nations with China's strategic interests and goals when they conflict with ours, or with other countries for that matter. I mean, the CNO has said himself that the LCSs are not something that he's going to send, heavily into war against China, but because they might be able to help prevent one, because they will be engaging in the exercises, the partnership building activities, maritime security, and thus maritime alliances, both formal and informal, that will perhaps prevent such a war from occurring in the first place. And I'm not saying this to recommend the LCS specifically. I can't get in the business of recommendations, but I am sort of emphasizing the CNO's broader point about reassuring allies and deterring adversaries. So what do you buy? And again, this isn't a recommendation. This, to me, is what comes logically out of sort of the points that I've made so far. Better weapons, better sensors, which I mentioned. Stealthy long-range strike, attack submarines, and surface combatants. Fourth, Peter asked the key question, of course, how do you pay for it? Well, with or without sequestration, it seems to me that we're going to be in for lean years for a long time to come in the Department of Defense, and indeed the federal government as a whole. The most optimistic scenario going forward is that the DoD base budget remains flat in real terms, the wars come to an end, and OCO as a funding mechanism goes away. Some new external shock could change that, of course, but we should not be in the business for hoping for an international crisis that is going to change our spending priorities. The money will need to come from within the Department of Defense writ large, and even from within the favored departments. For example, I'm not convinced that one more or less carrier strike group would make much of a difference in a contingency with China, but budgetarily, one carrier strike group equals about 10 attack submarines, which may make a difference in a contingency with China. And as I said earlier, as I alluded to, it may not necessarily be a bad thing if the force is allowed to hollow out a little bit and be a little bit less ready in return for a larger force structure, because you can fix a readiness problem much faster than you can fix a modernization or force structure problem. But that only is going to make sense if you actually modernize that larger force structure that you're maintaining at the cost of readiness. When the U.S. drew down after the Vietnam War, the nation was war-weary, but the cuts did not fall proportionally. Ground and Air Force budget reductions were much greater relative to the Navy's because, well, we thought we weren't going to be doing another land war in Asia for quite a while. However, readiness and modernization suffered after that. The Reagan buildup addressed both of those problems, but it fixed the readiness issue much more quickly. After the Berlin Wall fell, we cut proportionally amongst the services because we didn't see a future adversary to fight. What we wanted was an efficient, smaller military. We maintained readiness and did not have a modernization problem because we kept all the new stuff of the Reagan buildup and threw away all the old stuff. Today, we are not as triumphant as at the end of the Cold War, and I would not describe us personally as quite as war-weary as we were after Vietnam, at least not in the same way. But reductions and changes in the Department of Defense focus are inevitable. Readiness versus modernization is a real issue, and we should not reflexively assume that readiness should be the number one goal. We need to be smart about how we invest and focus the limited and constrained resources that we're going to have over the next 10 years, because the world doesn't end after the next FIDIP, and it doesn't even end after the next 10 years. The long term is important, and every decision we make today, and we can see this in both Navy force structure and Coast Guard force structure, is going to affect the long term in a cumulative way over a long period of time. And that ends the substance of my remarks.
Thanks very much, Eric. Before I ask for your questions, I'd like to ask the panelists, starting with Admiral Skinner, if they have any comments or other remarks based on what they've just heard their fellow panelists have to say. Sir?
Yeah, just one comment. So it comes down to a trade between new capabilities and how we fix and maintain existing things that we have. And that's the trade that we're in. And we can take new capabilities and we can dial them down till we go to min sustaining rates on all our production lines, all our ship lines, all our aircraft lines, you name it. When we dial down to min sustaining rate, then we're basically down to the red line for sustaining unless we're going to take a hit in our industrial base. The same way we're on the readiness side. Our fleet warfighters will dial down their readiness to say, I have a minimum readiness quotient. I need so many steaming days. My pilots need to fly so many hours per month. And if I go below that, I end up with a real issue with regards to my ability to be ready to go to war, or I have a safety issue in some aspects. My folks don't know how to fly. You know, they can't handle bad weather. They can't handle other things. So once we dial down to those red lines, it really becomes a choice based on risk of where we go. Or we have to figure out a way that we can do some things within the top line of our budgets, you know. And one of the things, because what we find ourselves in is we find ourselves in the position of we've inherited a force that was designed, in some cases, 20, 30 years ago, and was not designed for optimal life cycle cost. So the cost of operating that force has gone up. We also have an impetus, if you will, an imperative to design future forces to where life cycle costs are less. But in order to do that, the cost of the individual design of that particular type model series, that ship, has to be bigger. You know, the cost is greater than if we did a different design, a cheaper design that didn't take life cycle cost into account. And it's all occurring at the perfect storm moment when our top lines are coming down. And so in order to be able to do that, to have a force in the future that we can upgrade more cheaper, operate more effectively, it will cost us more in the near term at the exact time when we don't have any near-term dollars to do that. And so that's basically, you know, what we're looking at. So how can we deal with that? And one of the things we're doing is, you know, we have to get better at what we're doing, and you've seen the USD AT&L initiatives on how we acquire things better. We have to look at how we use the systems, you know, so we only buy the things that we need to use. And we just have to help ourselves within those constraints, or we'll have to make decisions that take risk in one of the two areas. You know, Eric said maybe it's time to take risk on the readiness side of the equation because we can reconstitute readiness faster than we can open up a shipyard to build a ship. Well, that's the decisions that we have to make. Once we dial down to the red lines across the board, and that's where we're headed, then it's going to become those types of decisions we're going to have to make.
Admiral Parker.
Thanks, and I'd agree with Mark. We're in that same balance. The numbers are smaller, obviously, but I think we're also a little closer to some of those red lines in some of our areas. And we balance that equation just a little bit differently. I can't disagree with anything that Eric said, because we have a first responder role at home as well. So that creates some interesting challenges for us as we go through that. I think another thing to think about for us, though, especially in light of the Joint Warfighters piece, when you talk about the C&O strategy and how we really want to maintain our alliances, there's a couple things that strike me there. Data points flash by us sometimes. You don't even see them coming. But sometime over the last year and a half, as the British Navy has pared down, we've actually become bigger, both in terms of number of ships and people, than the British Navy, which is a little unsettling when you think about it on a number of fronts. When you look at how we relate to the navies of the world, most of the navies of the world, with very few exceptions, are more constabulatory in nature than they are power projection. So we have great relevance there. And as we pare down, we become less of a viable partner for the Navy to go out and help in some of those areas. So we're trying to find smarter ways to go about and do that. I think we're doing that well with Mark Fox over in the Fifth Fleet right now, although his change of command is coming up very shortly. I expect that to continue. But how do we really sweat out these relationships we have, both internal within the United States with the agencies we have here and with our alliances and partners, and how do we do that in a smart way that helps everybody sort of make it through these tough times? So those are some observations I have as well, and I'll pass it on down to Fred.
Yeah, thanks. I think the only thing I would add is that to reiterate the point that readiness has a lot to do with training. And of course, I'm joint right now, but just for a moment, let me be Army and just say that when you think about readiness in Army terms, there is the operational readiness of particular fleets of equipment, but the very first thing you think about is the readiness of the soldier, and that's paramount. And so, harkening back to my previous remarks, I mean, I think this really does come down to how much were you going to invest in an individual, not just soldiers, but soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. It's for the Army, for a moment, it's not about the platform, it's about the person. And so I think in a time of constrained resources, it's more than imprudent to not focus on training and maintaining readiness of the individual. Now, again, I'm speaking somewhat parochially for that statement when it comes to the Army, and I think it probably I might be so bold as to extend it. I think it also applies to the Marine Corps as well. But that's as far as I would take it. Thank you.
Dr. Labs.
Just a couple, I guess, quick comments. I would agree that in the case of the Coast Guard, that they've been sort of living this problem for a long time. They are forced to, because they are indeed first responders, to maintain a high state of readiness, and consequently, the fleet of their large cutters has aged dramatically. You're talking about an average age of 40 years for some of the Coast Guard's major assets. So there is in other words, the Coast Guard writ small could potentially be the Navy's future, depending on what the level of resources we find ourselves investing in over the years, and depending on what choices we make and how we spend that money. And at the same time, I raise this question of readiness versus modernization as a point of discussion. I'm not actually coming out and saying that I favor one view or the other, but I just sort of want to raise it as a topic, a sort of way to think about it, because I'm a civilian analyst. I'm never going to be flying the plane. I'm never going to be engaging in the military operations. I'm not going to be called up when a crisis pops up with a piece of equipment that doesn't work very well, or I'm not trained that well. That isn't going to be my job. I'm going to be sitting comfortably and safely back home. At the same time, when we're sort of talking about these issues from a broad policy and fiscal position, there are different debates that we can have, and I think it's worth actually having them.
Before I open it to the floor, I just have one comment to make on, I guess it's on Dr. Labs' approach during his remarks, and that is he started in a way that certainly appeals to me as somebody that's been in the business of writing strategic documents much of his adult life. He started with the current national strategy. It's important to have a strategy. It really is. It does a lot of things for you. And when you have that strategy and it gives you some direction, you're then able to, from that strategy, derive the kinds of elements that Dr. Labs did in his presentation, which he did and which we haven't, we can't fault. But I think it's also important to remember that we didn't see Korea coming. We didn't see Vietnam coming. We didn't see Haiti coming. We didn't see the end of the Cold War coming. I don't think we saw Panama coming. We didn't see Grenada coming. You know where this is headed. And we certainly didn't see 9/11 coming. And so while I, of all people, think that there's great value in strategic documents and in principles involved in them, and then coming up with schemes as to what we buy and how we buy it based on that, the real world gets a vote, and Trotsky's point is well worth mentioning. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you, and we sometimes have to take that into account as well. Anyway, I think we've been pretty good. We've limited our remarks, and we all like to talk up here to about 40 minutes, which gives you another 45 minutes for your questions. So if you would come on up to the microphones, if anybody has a question for the panel, I'm ready to entertain them.
Somebody's got to break the ice.
Yeah. Good morning.
Okay, yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Bill Wyatt. I'm retired Navy.
And thank you for that. If you would mention who you are and what your affiliation is, that'd be great. Thanks.
I don't work for anyone, just myself. I've been a destroyer, cruiser program manager. I've been a fleet maintenance officer. I've kind of been in both sides of this problem. I think we've crossed the red line. And I guess my question to Admiral Skinner and to Dr. Labs, I don't know what's going to give, but right now we're overrunning our budgets on most of our complex new construction, schedules and costs. We're not putting enough money into our fleet maintenance to get the expected service lives of our ships. You look at the cost growth that's growing once an availability is started in our fleet units, it's just outrageous in the surface Navy. I'm not talking about submarines now. I don't know where you're going. The numbers are important, and it looks to me like, if you listen to the CNO, we can't maintain the current op tempo. We're not building enough ships. We're not putting enough money into the maintenance of the ones we've got. I don't see a very good picture here, and I would just ask you, do any of you see a long-range solution to this problem? I'll sit down and I didn't mean to make a speech, but it doesn't look very good from where I stand.
Yeah, I can take a shot. So overrunning our budgets on new construction is the first point that you made, sir. And we've taken aim at that over the course of the last couple of years. My boss, Secretary Stackley, 2 years ago when I first came into the job, he'd already been in the job probably a couple of years. And when we entered into fiscal 11, we had not got a ship on contract in a while, And in the course of the last year, I think we put something on the order of 34 to 35 ships on contract. And the way we did that was, under the Secretary's guidance, was he basically told us, we will not sign a bad deal, period. And he injected competition back into the ship, back into the purchases of those ships to the greatest extent that we could. And that's basically in the DDG lines, in the Virginia, and the LCS. And by virtue of insisting on a competition and taking the time element out of that, in other words, he said basically, you can't come to me and say, my money's expiring, I've got an Inca contract. He said, if your money's expiring, I'll go to the Hill and talk to the folks on the Hill and explain to them that this puts us in a bad place from a negotiation standpoint. We'll get an extension on the dollars, and then we'll sit down and negotiate in good faith. And so in the course of the last year, I believe, we put on 30-plus ships on contract, most of them in competitions, most of them in long-term contracts and multi-years where we could reap benefits and savings that we have plowed back into the new construction piece. Now, there's certain elements of the portfolio on the shipbuilding side that we can't do that, carriers, but we've taken a real hard look at the CVN 78. We've deconstructed where the cost growth is in the 78. We've focused on material purchasing and the amount of the percentage of that ship that we have outfitted in modules before they're lifted on the ship as our two metrics, and we'll transfer those lessons learned to 79. 78, we employed 3 new technologies in that ship all at the same time on a lead ship, the DBR, the dual band radar, the catapult and arresting gear, the new nuclear power plant. So that is a revolutionary design in my mind. It's a Nimitz-class hull that's completely different. And so, carriers aside, the rest of the portfolio from that standpoint is in pretty good shape. Now, cost availabilities for existing ships, we've taken a look at that. deconstructed that. Kevin McCoy, who's NAVC, ComNavC, has basically seen that in the availabilities when emergent work hits, and we try to do emergent work that we haven't pre-planned in availabilities, then we have to go into overtime and extend availabilities and get that work done. And that costs us a lot of money and cost growth. And so we're putting policies in place to say if we find something in an availability and it's not critical, then we won't do it in that availability. We'll log it. And the next availability that the ship has, we'll go through the normal planning process where we can get that work done at a much cheaper rate and a much cheaper price than we could if we try to do it in an emergent fashion. Now, that doesn't preclude us from doing the emergent work that's critical and safety related and maintenance related. We need to get the ship out of the yard. But so how we do it, how we control our appetites and how we do it, that's key, I think. But it's certainly within our, it's squarely within our focus each and every day. Secretary Mavis has two major focuses as the Secretary of the Navy. One is energy, and two is buying ships. And so we think about that a lot.
Anybody else want to take a crack at that?
I would like
Dr.
to
Lance.
add a couple of points. One, it seems to me that there's an iron triangle about dealing with sort of your funding and force structure problem that you describe. I mean, you know, you can give more money to the Navy to buy its ship program, you can buy cheaper ships, or you can have less force structure. The odds of getting a lot more money for the Navy shipbuilding program are probably not very great given the budgetary environment that we're facing. The Navy has already gone down the path of trying to pursue cheaper ships by buying things like the LCS, by canceling the CGX in favor of sort of restarting the DDG-51 and so forth. So it seems to me that what you're facing is, over time, is less force structure, because the Navy long-term shipbuilding plan asks for a lot more money than what they're getting over the next 5 years for the long term. And in my judgment, the Navy shipbuilding plan, the funding requirements they ask for are less than what they're really going to need to be able to buy the ships that they have in their program. So I think one of the things that we're going to have to decide as a nation is ultimately is how much Navy is enough and how much is too little. I don't have an answer or recommendation for that. That's not my job, but that is, I think, going to be a question. The thing that I'm most concerned about, though, is that we take these decisions incrementally on a year-by-year basis, and they have long-term cumulative effects. You can cut one ship or two ships from the program this year. It doesn't matter too much. The Navy's still going to be 280 ships next year. But come 2030, what is it going to look like if you're doing that every year?
As someone who stood at that microphone in an earlier panel for minutes waiting for somebody up here to notice me, I have great affection for that particular microphone. Let me call on this gentleman.
Thank you, sir. Ken Davey from the Boeing Company. This is a question that occurred to me yesterday during the UAV panel discussion, but the right people really weren't there to answer it. It's a question that regards the acquisition process, the utility of program of record purchasing versus service contracts, and where this applied in that conversation was the smaller class 1, 2, 3 UAVs, VT UAVs, UUVs, ground vehicles, where the technology is changing so rapidly. What is the tipping point for you, for both the Navy and the Coast Guard, which have kind of different processes, I'm thinking, between going with a program of record for a capability to meet a warfighter requirement or solving the warfighter requirement by engaging in a service contract with a vendor?
I'll take that one. Thank you. This is a classic conundrum, and it's not just in the UAV world, but that's, I think, where all of these acquisition pieces are going, where Moore's Law is eclipsing our acquisition timelines because of a whole number of things, both the size, the scale, the oversight. All those pieces conspire against us to take full advantage of the technologies. And so that drives us to some of the solutions that we get there. I think one of the other challenges with UAVs is it's taken us a while to understand sort of philosophically where those are best utilized, both in the small and the large and the medium size, and when you really want to take a pilot or a crew out of an equation, and whether that's just pure on crew endurance because, you know, the weight of the pilot and the crew equals fuel in the current paradigm anyway, and payload, which could be something otherwise helpful, or because of some attendant risk. In our world, mostly it's the fuel payload issues, and then where do I get them where I need them, especially in far forward operating areas where it's basically a water desert and you've got a lot of broad area surveillance kind of things you need to do. Or are they local and tactical things where you can put one up over a national security special event and have an eyes-on full-time over a certain package that we were wanting to maintain risk. So I think it's across the whole spectrum. We've tried to be very artful in how we go about doing that. We've already pulled some service contracts for some of the smaller ones because they are refreshing so quickly, and in some cases we've just run out and bought them because they're affordable. So there's a sweet spot at 3 different levels as we go through that. And the longer-term piece, try to take advantage of other people who are in the acquisition world. DHS, CBP, Air Marine has some larger capabilities. We've certainly used Global Hawk where we can on an as-available basis. So I'm agnostic about where that comes from, and I'm always looking for that balance point at multiple different levels from the do the best you can with what you got guy out in the field.
Yeah, I think it's a make-buy decision. We have to decide what we want to make and what we want to buy as a service. And the implication in some cases is that if we buy as a service, it can be cheaper. And as long as we buy the service that we specify in a contract, it could be. But due to the emergent nature of war fighting and what goes on, sometimes the modifications to contracts that we have on the service side rapidly ratchet up the price and make those services unaffordable over the long term. So it certainly is a make-buy decision. A lot of things have to go into it. I believe it should be applied on a case-by-case basis.
I'll just take questions going along the floor, and please tell
you.
us who you are and what your affiliation is.
Gentlemen, I'm Pat Tully. I'm Deputy Joint Plans Officer, Military SEAL Command, Washington Navy Yard. And first and foremost, I want to thank you all for your service. My question is to you, Dr. Lapp. We've heard from Secretary Panetta and senior leadership at DoD that we're now going to concentrate back into the Pacific here as we draw down our forces from the Middle East to the CENTCOM area wall. However, there's an element within DoD that's saying that's the wrong move, that we shouldn't be concentrating in the Western Pacific, that our real threat still remains in the Eastern Mediterranean here, in the CENTCOM, Persian Gulf, that area of the world. Can you comment on that, please?
I guess the only things I would add to that is that that's certainly possible. I'm not going to be in the business here of saying that the strategy is right or wrong. That is a strategy that has been promulgated by the executive branch, and the executive branch necessarily is going to lead in offering up a national strategy. Certainly the Congress will have a role in the formulation, not in the formulation, but in sort of the implementation of that strategy. If they feel the executive branch is wrong, their funding priorities would certainly have an effect. As I sort of think about this, it kind of depends on what you think the threat is going to be in, say, the CENTCOM area. If you think it's an al-Qaeda problem only or a terrorism problem only, and this is sort of more, speculation on my part, I don't think that necessarily requires a very large force structure to address. We've had a great deal of success with, intelligence services in cooperation with other countries, and certainly the drone campaign, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, has been reasonably debilitating on the al-Qaeda's ability to certainly mount large-scale attacks on the United States. So I'm not so sure that is going to be a big funding driver. If you think the problem in the future is less China and maybe it is a country like Iran, that's certainly a very big question and very worthy of a debate that goes directly to the heart of sort of the strategy and ultimately the force structure implications. Although I'm not so sure it detracts from the long-term perspective that I'm saying, that I was talking about in my initial remarks, because whatever you think about Iran, I don't think it's necessarily a problem in 2030 or 2040. I think it's more sort of the next 10 years, but it does go to this issue then of readiness versus immediate modernizations. If you think Iran is going to be the problem, you probably don't want to give up too much on your readiness, because the force structure you have today is the one that you're going to be using. If you think the long-term problem is another country, China or a resurgent Russia, then you have to keep a much sharper eye on your long-term modernization.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Anybody?
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is Bud Jewett. I've got a NavAir background, a little bit of acquisition in the Pentagon. Currently, I've been out for about 10 years working for industry. I've got a different perspective now than I did when I was in the service. Currently working for Crane Aerospace and Electronics. What surprised me is what I didn't hear. What I didn't hear were comments with regard to contractor investment, industry investment, taking a look at the balance between evolutionary and revolutionary, rewarding industry for coming to the party with something that looks at current capability and future requirements that are yet to be determined. I would have expected some comments on flexibility, robustness, open architecture, a lot of the different buzzwords that talk about modularity, scalability, and I'm talking from an avionics background, so you can see where the thinking is coming from. But it seems that where we're trying to be very, very cost conscious, where we can't buy everything, evolutionary rather than revolutionary, except where industry has developed something, has demonstrated it, it's in a manageable risk band that we can afford to take that step, seems to make a lot of sense. I thought I would have heard just a little bit more comment on something along that line.
Anybody want to try that? It seems to me that this is one area in which the non-hardware aspects are as important as well. Contractors support us in training, modeling, simulation, all of those kinds of things. So perhaps General Rudesheim or some of the other panelists might have some comments on this as well. Anybody?
I'll take it on briefly, though. The extent we've got in the organization that I belong to, Joint Coalition Warfighting, we've got a fairly significant contract workforce, and we actually couldn't make ends meet without it, to be very direct. But we've also gotten, I think, better at figuring out how much we need, and we're actually scaling the numbers based on the work requirements. So I don't know if the term on demand really resonates or not. It's working so far where we realize this is how much work we have, and then we're able to, we look first to the government civilians and the military to be able to handle it, and then we look for those unique skill sets that only contract workers could bring to the table. I don't know if that model is, so I'm staying with what I know and what we do right now. It's working well for us, and I think that that's the way we're going to have to continue in the near future. When the money goes down, and it either stays steady state or goes down, and that's the reality I'll live. Then I will have to adjust my line based on the contract support that I get. And I will simply have to be very direct about what I'm not going to do anymore and leave it to the folks that provide the funds to realize, the reality of that. But I will lay it out as dispassionately as possible and just say, okay, this now means I've just lost this capability and now this capability, and then my new red line is this. And either the leadership I respond to will either agree with that, or they'll seek other alternatives.
Anybody else want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, I'll take a shot. Hey, Bud, it's good to see you again. How you doing?
Nice to see you, sir.
We have to do that. We have to be smart. One of the ways that we can make our acquisition dollars go farther is to look at what other folks are investing in industry, broader based, and ride that investment wave. Software, Moore's Law, those types of things come to mind. And so we have to design systems that have that, and we are. It takes time to transition the force that we built that lasts 30 to 40 years into something like that, but we're trying to do that in a smart manner to take advantage. It annoys me that Moore's Law changes the amount of computing power you can put on a chip every 18 months, and it takes me 10 years to put it into a ship or an airplane. That's fairly annoying, okay? The fact that I can put a software load out every 2 years, but I can't train my sailors to use it, it takes me 3 years to train them to use the software load, is kind of annoying. So the system's out of whack a little bit. I have to tune the system so that I can take advantage of the fact that industry is investing in those things, and then I can design software and put it in the fleet in a cycle, and my training systems have to be tuned to that same cycle so that my sailors can use it. And that's a whole 2 or 3 hour discussion in itself. Where industry can help is a couple of different ways. First of all, you can take the IRAD money, the money that you have, and devote a portion of it to a long-term vision that maybe talks about how can we change the business models so that we can, instead of selling the services, proprietary systems, closed systems, accept open architecture, build, the internet for whatever we're going to do, that backbone, and put it into all of our future Department of Defense systems, and then compete on a different level. Put a portion of your money towards that. I know a lot of your money goes into what do we need to do to win the next competition, but some of it needs to go into that long-term vision. And help us get to that non-proprietary set so that we can compete at the app level instead of competing at the phone level. And that's kind of what we need to do, I think.
Thank you.
Gentleman at the far microphone.
Raymond Pritchett. I blog at Information Dissemination in the United States Naval Institute. My question is for the Admiral. You started by saying that there was a necessity to establish requirements with clarity. The DDG-1000 is a 15,000-ton ship. Primary requirement that drove a lot of decisions is stealth. The Littoral Combat Ship is being described as the vessel that's going to go out to the lower tier threat environments to allow the larger ships to operate in other environments, but we chose speed instead of endurance. The DDG-51 Flight 3 is a circa 1970s design, but if we pay for it in fiscal year 18, commission in 23, serve 40 years to 63, 80 years, so the requirement suggests that 80 years of viability. Is the requirements process for shipbuilding broken?
Well, I speak here as an individual and don't represent the views of my service, probably. I'm assuming this is not for attribution. You raise good points.
Okay, an important point, which the Admiral said his remarks right now are not for attribution. Anybody else?
I'll take advantage of that just to add, sort of one more thing to sort of think about in this process that we haven't raised directly, but is obviously relevant. And that's the issue, of course, of quality versus quantity. There's the old, the old hat is that, quantity has a quality all of its own, but at the same time, you often confronted with the choices of do you buy, one really brand spanking new modern system, or do you buy two somewhat older design systems? So, like the GAO report on the DDG-51 restart and the Flight 3 has raised a lot of questions about the longevity of the Flight 3 over the entire course of its expected to be 40-year service life. The DDG-51 was not originally designed to last 40 years. It was not originally designed to last 35 years. It was originally designed to last 30 years. So now we have a design that's going to, upgrades to this ship that are supposed to last 40 years. If you get 40 years out of that ship, it's a pretty good deal. But if you get 25 years out of that ship when you might have gotten 35 or 40 out of a new design, that raises sort of a different set of questions. And so I think that's another thing that we need to sort of think about in this calculus. But then it goes back to one of my points earlier to one of the gentleman's first questions, is that if you're going for quality over quantity, you're necessarily accepting, in the case of the Navy, a smaller fleet. How small is too small then at that point?
Gentleman here, and I think this is going to wind up being our last question. Yes, sir.
Hi, Ron Raymer. I spent 30 years in the Navy, currently working for Fleet Forces. My question, kind of related to what he said here, it's kind of a codicil of that, is that it seems that our requirements process is almost glacial compared to what it needs to be today. The enemies or the adversaries are always inside our OODA loop, and they're always changing. And we simply can't get weapon systems and new systems out there fast enough to try and fix it. I've heard a couple of 2 and 3 stars say, I can write a con-op for what I'm going to do in this situation, but I have very little confidence that this is going to manage the problem if it actually occurs. So I guess my question is, unless we have a dramatic change in the way the requirements are defined and funded, what can we do to try and get new technologies, new systems out into the fleet quicker? I was a plank owner on Theodore Roosevelt, 1986. Saw some great equipment when I walked aboard. I went aboard the George Herbert Walker Bush 2-3 months ago, and I was disappointed to see that it was a very familiar sight, because most of the equipment that they had on there was the same stuff we had 25, 26 years ago. So I guess how can we get ahead of the adversaries?
I'll jump on that. And I don't know that the process is so much broken as it's just dated, and then we don't curb our appetite appropriately to the budgets that we have sometimes is the issue. But in terms of getting inside the enemy's decision cycle, for me, it's really a matter of understanding where the things you have add value. As an operator, I can't really tell you that in a very sort of repeatable and valid way. We have a lot of data. For those who heard the piece this morning, there's a lot of data out there. And as long as every different element of us, and even internally within our services, is allowed to collect data differently, that causes people to put work into cataloging that and pushing that out there, that then in context becomes information, and then to the decision maker becomes knowledge, hopefully. If you don't have that in a way that's very, very agile right now, and I would argue that at least we don't, that's going to be problematic to understand where our value is. So before I can even get to the process to know where it's broken, I can't even tell you where I'm not adding value with the activities that we provide, both operationally and through the acquisition and requirements processes. Those three things all come together in a very sort of unhelpful way if you don't know what you're up against, and you're making decisions based on data that's not repeatable over time. In terms of where you go from a process standpoint to get inside your enemy's decision cycle, tell me who the enemy is in 20 years or 40 years for the life cycle of that ship. There's some very sort of generic things that we think about when we get there in terms of, asymmetric threats and those things, non-state actors. But that's very, very hard to get to that point when you're into major capital acquisition. So I go back to Fred's point. How do I prepare the warfighter, the supporter, to get in a sufficiently agile mindset where they can react to these things on scene? When you get into the cyber world, you're definitely going to see this. And the requirements for that, the things that you have in the time compression there is in nanoseconds, not in weeks and months and years, which are the kind of timelines that our processes were built on. So we really, I think, have to change the process, but I'm loath to do that until I understand the value chain a little bit better.
Anybody else want to take a whack at that? We are just about at...
Let me just add one thing to that. When we acquire major programs, acquire anything in the department, there's a requirements piece of it and an acquisition piece of it, and we have got to come to grips with cycle time. I am firmly convinced that it is going to pretty quickly ratchet up to a significant national issue, because we know how to put things in the field quickly. We did that with MRAP. Okay? When lives were on the line, all the organizations got together and stacked hands, and that's the Congress, the department, the service, industry. We all agreed that this was intolerable. It was intolerable that we would have, our sailors, our soldiers, our Marines, our airmen driving around country and getting blown up by roadside bombs. We would not accept that. And as a country, we got together and said, okay, we're going to find some good people, we're going to hold them accountable, and we're going to give them a timeline, and we're going to turn them loose and let them run. And we put systems in the field very, very quickly. So we have to get back to somewhat of that model. Now, I understand there has to be oversight in the process, but I would submit to you that oversight has run amok. And there is too much oversight in the current system. There's anecdotal evidence that says, if you run a null set of requirements through the acquisition process in the Pentagon without trying to buy anything, it takes like between 3 and 4 years just to get through the existing process. Now, I don't know, that's anecdotal, but I do know this, that one of my program managers and PEOs got an emergent rapid development kind of a system to put into the fleet under strict guidance from the CNO. And in order to get to a decision from the Milestone Decision Authority, just to get to a decision to say, I want to start an analysis of alternatives to determine what I want, my program team had to brief 142 times. 142 times just to get to the decision maker that could make the decision to start the analysis to determine what we wanted. And I would submit to you that process is broken. So somewhere between too much oversight and not enough, we have to come together with all the parties and discuss. Now look, there's been 35 years worth of acquisition reform documents that you can go out and look to all the way back to, the 70s, okay? And every one of them says pretty much the same thing. But somewhere along the line, we have to have the will as a country to implement and execute. Because the point that was made is exactly right. Our potential adversaries are out-turning us. They're out-turning us. And it's not because we can't turn with them, it's because we choose not to. So I'll get off my soapbox. Thanks.
Anybody else? Well, that was a panel. Frank and incisive panelists, questioners from the audience who weren't afraid to pull any punches. And thanks very much. How about a big hand for the questioners and the panelists?
Everybody here thanks you. This was a great panel. It's maintained the great momentum, and it's tough being on the third day. We really appreciate you being here. As a small token of our appreciation, we have a Naval Institute Press book, Keep All the Thoughtful Men, and it has an AFCEA bookmark. But thanks again for all your service every day and for your service today. Please join us for the lunch, where we'll talk about the air-sea battle with two relatively outspoken, not shy people in General Deptula and Admiral Fitzgerald. Thank you.